I think what's different between China and the US and Europe is fiscal position.
Gold has kind of emerged recently in the last 10 years or so as a really popular dollar alternative.
I don't think people are going to be leaving New York that in droves because of the tax rate.
Money on my mind and my mind on my money.
Is the EU really going to say we want to clamp down on human rights abuses abroad, even if it means that Europeans freeze during winter? Hello and welcome to The Dip. It is your essential podcast, as always, where we connect the world of money to the US and the US to the world of money. I am Daniel.
And I'm Kassandra. We are here today with our question and answer episode where we lurk through the comments and bring you only the best questions and comments from your fellow listeners and viewers in order to get some answers from the panel of experts that we are always consulting. So hopefully you'll feel enlightened and hopefully we'll get some enlightenment too.
Well, do you know what? We should just kick it straight off,
Let's
I think. So first up was a comment on our video about food prices. Gaming Tonight 1526 pointed out, food will never get cheaper as long as we don't deal with the climate crisis. All these floods, heat waves, wildfires, etc. have impacts on farms and ranches, just like they do with homes and people.
It's a great point, and we put it to DW environment reporter Charlie Shields, who, in addition to having a great superhero name, is also working on a series about the costs of climate change. So let's have a listen.
So in response to this comment, it is pretty spot on. Food prices do increase for different reasons, but one of them increasingly is climate change. And so as global warming continues and climate change gets worse, we are going to continue to see a rise in food prices. And that is mostly because a global average temperature increases the likelihood of extreme weather events like flooding, wildfires, droughts, and heat waves. And those events obviously have an impact on farmers' ability to grow food, which then translates into supply issues, which then drives up food prices. So we've seen numerous documented examples of this happening in recent years. For example, in 2024 in Ghana and on the Ivory Coast, there was a heat wave that drove up global cocoa prices by 280%. In 2022, there was extreme flooding in Australia that caused lettuce prices to spike by 300%. In 2023, there was a drought in Brazil that caused global coffee prices to spike by 55%. The list goes on. Essentially, as long as we continue to burn fossil fuels that heat the atmosphere, we are going to continue to see this trend of rising food prices.
Thanks to Charlie for that answer, and keep your eyes and ears on the feed in the weeks ahead because we're going to have Charlie back to talk more about this series right here on The Dip.
Yeah, and so another topic that has been crossing our minds recently has been currencies, my favorite topic.
Money on my mind and my mind on my money.
Yeah, I love having more currency. That's what I know. So we recently had a whole episode about de-dollarization. So if you go back in your feed and listen to the show from Friday, then you'll be able to hear it. But one question from LF9233 asked, couldn't it be that the main difference between the EU versus US and China is the monetary regime of the EU and the lack of solidarity which has enforced strict austerity measures when there was a crisis, while in the US and China they engage in expansive monetary policy which kept the market liquid and economic actors more risk acceptance. So I think basically what they're saying here is the EU is made up of so many different countries which needs to have so many different fiscal policies, and they've somehow got to coalesce around some sort of monetary policy with the ECB, whereas the US can just act and China can just act.
100%. And we put that question to our DW business colleague, Mathis Richtman.
Great question. I think I just want to point to one thing immediately. Because monetarily, Europe has been very accommodating and expansive as well. I think what's different between China and the US and Europe is fiscal position. And that's where the austerity comes in that the user mentions. And sure, I think that is a very good way to sort of position these two or these three regions against each other. I think the important aspect here to focus on is that I think, Europe wasn't wanting to be fiscally expansive very much and didn't want to spend very much. There's a couple of, like Germany is very reluctant to take on debt, and then they've been pushing this agenda in other countries too. The important aspect, though, is that Europe, different from these other two, from China and the US, is very fragmented, right? You have a ton of different banking jurisdictions. You have different laws that govern how banks and states interact. So it makes it very difficult for Europe to be fiscally expansive as a whole. That doesn't really justify what they did. I think, yes, that is a big part of why Europe is sort of lagging behind these other two. But I think it's helpful to look at the context. And it's not that easy to change, actually.
Thanks again to Matas for that answer. But this actually wasn't the only question or comment that we had recently about currencies and reserves, was it?
That is right, because we have one from Abdur Razak 6222, who pointed out the Asian governments are withdrawing reserves from Western nations after freezing Russian assets and using them to fund the Ukraine war. The nations started to move their foreign reserves from the West.
Now, there was a bit of political analysis and commentary there, which of course we always appreciate, but we put that question to Daniel McDowell. He's the author of Bucking the Buck, and we asked him, essentially, are Asian governments withdrawing reserves, and if so, why?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we see in the sort of global aggregate data, looking at the dollar's share of reserves, again, at the 30,000 foot level, what we see now isn't a mass shift in the last few years away from the dollar. We just see a continuation of a gradual decline in the dollar share of global reserves. That's really a 20-year story, not even a 5-year story. There are at individual country levels examples where we have seen dramatic shifts, Russia in 2018 being probably the best example I can think of. Similarly, in Turkey around the same time, we saw a big drop in treasury holdings. So there are some of these one-off cases where it seems like there was a strategic move out of the dollar. But, in terms of China, there's no real evidence that China has had a dramatic shift out of treasuries. Instead, what we are seeing is interest among central banks in emerging countries with strained relations with the United States, growing interest in some alternatives. We've discussed the fact that there aren't a lot of dollar alternatives. Gold has kind of emerged recently in the last 10 years or so as a really popular dollar alternative. It has downsides, but it has some upsides as well. And so we've seen countries like China, we've seen countries like India buying a lot more gold. And anytime you're shifting more into something else, there's an opportunity cost. You're not buying other assets, most likely dollar assets. And so that could be having some sort of downside effects on overall dollar holdings. But, long story short, no mass shifts out of the dollar in any sort of conspiratorial way right now.
Thanks again to Daniel McDowell for that answer. Now I want to turn to another Daniel Winter.
That's me.
That's you, because I have a point that I think you would be great at tackling.
Okay, go on.
So this week we got a comment. It was actually posted on last week's Q&A episode. It comes from Alex Kaler. Alex said, you don't really care about workers' rights or human rights, as you wouldn't be running a trade deficit with places that don't afford people those rights. You're just cynically talking about this in this context. You don't really believe in it. Big difference. And Daniel, I'm sure you have thoughts.
Yeah, I think they're talking about the EU, not me personally.
Not you personally, no.
So the idea that isn't the EU hypocritical because it says, okay, we are pro-human rights, but yet we trade with nations which maybe don't have great human rights.
Happy to buy products made cheaply.
Exactly. And of course, it is an extraordinarily difficult thing to do. I think I should just break this down a bit because there are a bunch of trade-offs here which aren't easy. So, I mean, just this week we heard the Qatari energy minister basically say that if the EU doesn't remove or water down its, get ready for this, Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which
rolls off the tongue.
Is a great bit of bureaucratic Europeanism. The idea is that this requires companies that do any business with the EU to monitor their supply chains and see that they're not contributing to human rights abuses or to harming the environment in a certain way, which is described within this rule. If the EU doesn't remove or water this down, then Qatar will essentially stop selling liquefied natural gas to the EU. And that is a big deal. Now, while I don't expect this would actually happen, that it would actually come to that. Of course, they're going to sit around a table and discuss before it even got to that. But just even thinking about the threat is really interesting. Is the EU really going to say, we want to clamp down on human rights abuses abroad, even if it means that Europeans freeze during winter.
Yeah, their own citizens.
Their own citizens. I mean, that's a surefire way to get voted out of office if that's the way you're going to go about business. Of course, it's not that clean cut, but that is why it's a complicated subject. And then there's Indonesia, for example. So the EU wants lithium from Indonesia and other metals as well, because it doesn't want to be overly dependent on China for certain rare earths and other minerals that it needs for its production processes. Now, I spoke to the Indonesian ambassador to Germany, who told me back then that what the EU is doing with its deforestation legislation to try and clamp down on palm oil, that it was putting far too much pressure on Indonesia, and that they couldn't do a trade deal with the EU if the EU insisted on pushing forward with the deforestation legislation. And again, should the EU say, well, we're going to sacrifice our independence when it comes to rare earths. We're going to just play into China and be completely dependent on China, so that we get to lecture another country on what it can or cannot do with its rainforest. So you see how it's another one of these moral dilemmas. And while palm oil exports from Indonesia to the EU fell, they essentially just got replaced by China. That was the fact of what happened in the end. So the practice didn't end, it just shifted, and all the EU got out of it was a warm, fuzzy glow. So of course you can see why our questioner is so riled up. You know, how can the EU say deforestation bad or human rights abuses bad on its own land, but then just outsource production to other countries when, which then funds these kinds of bad practices?
Yeah.
And of course, legislating morality into commerce is always going to be a very thorny issue, and the EU is already admonished for putting idealism and bureaucracy above growth or innovation. And there is a balancing act to be struck here. So you should do what you can, of course, to influence others to clean up their act, but just going full tilt into moralizing may leave the EU with fewer friends, less leverage, and basically the planet no cleaner than before. There being no improvement to working conditions than before. And all the EU will get out of it is a thicker stack of compliance paperwork.
Now, one last question before we go. There's a new mayor-elect in the biggest U.S. city. Zohran Mamdani will take the reins of New York City in the new year, and DW's coverage of that election got some questions from you all.
Yeah, Peter Lem1 posted, is a 2% corporate tax increase, which brings New York City on par with New Jersey, really too extremist to consider? Is providing public childcare actually a dangerous socialist idea?
Okay, so just a little bit of context here. In his platform, Mamdani points out that New York State has lower corporate tax rates than many of its neighbors. He wants the corporate tax rate to go from 7.25% to 11.5% to match New Jersey. So that's what Peter's talking about. And then there's also a 2% proposed income tax on millionaires as well that Mamdani is looking to implement. So there's kind of two planks to the tax policy there that Mayor-elect Mamdani wants to bring forward. So we brought that question to Cameron Fenn. He's an economist at State Street, and we asked him how extreme are these tax ideas compared to what we have seen elsewhere in the U.S.
The tax rate, the corporate tax rate is high in New York City, not as high as New Jersey. Again, I may have written that article before. I don't remember exactly those facts, but yeah, I think an 11% corporate tax rate from the state is a fairly high tax rate. Again, as I said before, I don't think people are going to be leaving New York that in droves because of the tax rate, simply because New York is A, the best city for people to live in, and B, because it's the best city for people to live in, it's one of the best cities for corporations to hire people from and have, buildings and headquarters and offices in, right? And then talking about the 2% tax rate on millionaires and billionaires, again, you have that same argument, right? Like, it's a not insignificant amount, but if you make $1 million at most, that's like a $20,000 thing. I think it's a small price to pay for living in, again, the greatest city in the world for someone who has $100 million or more, right? So I don't think they're huge worries. I think the corporate tax rate is higher than I would be more uncomfortable with the corporate tax rate being that high rather than the individual tax rate on millionaires and billionaires. But I think both are manageable still. And again, like what our the people in Europe, especially Scandinavia, they have much higher tax rates, and they seem to be doing pretty well, right? So.
Thank you very much to Cameron Fenn for answering that question for us. And if you want to get some answers from our panel of experts and from our global network of correspondents, I love saying that, then you could just leave a comment under this video if you're watching it on YouTube, or you can get in touch in other ways too.
For example, email. You can send us an email at thedip@dw.com, and we'll be back with more money stories on Friday at The Dip.